Every square is a rectangle. But not every rectangle is a square. We all learned that in high school math class, no doubt. Similarly, every recliner is a chair, but not every chair is a recliner. That's just common sense. Every flamingo is a bird, but not every bird is a flamingo. Every Taco Bell is a fast food joint, but not every fast food joint is a Taco Bell. You can't roll up to a McDonald's and expect to order gordita. Hashtag hard truths. Similarly, every 1966 Shelby Mustang GT350 with a 363 stroker V8 and manual 5-speed transmission in candy apple red with a black vinyl interior is a car. But driving around in my little 2017 Chevy Spark with, get this, crank windows. Bet you didn't even know that they still made those, but they do. But driving around in that little Chevy Spark, I can testify this morning that not every car is a 1966 Shelby Mustang GT350 with a 363 stroker V8 and a manual 5-speed transmission in candy apple red with a black vinyl interior. The good Lord up in heaven only knows. Similarly, in this morning's reading from chapters 9 and 10 of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus Christ says that every one of his followers, everyone who goes out into the world to carry on his ministry of mercy and compassion, everyone who truly walks the path of radical, transforming, revolutionary love that he has laid before us, everyone who does those things, he says, will be met with hatred, judgment, and condemnation at one point or another. But, just because you are experiencing hatred, judgment, and condemnation does not automatically mean that you are following Jesus. Every square is a rectangle, but not every rectangle is a square. Amen? More likely it is the case, as 21st century American Christians, more likely it is the case that when we are finding ourselves suddenly being judged and condemned by a lot of people, more likely it is the case that judgment and that condemnation is the natural consequence of our own poor decision making and our own bad behavior. Or to put it a little more brusquely, as admittedly I want to do, it's less likely that you are being persecuted for being an impassioned follower of Jesus, and it is far, far more likely that you are being called out for being a grade A jerk. Now, why does this need to be said? This needs to be said because we are living in a strange moment in this nation's history. 1 year after the Trump presidency, 2 years into a pandemic, we're living in this strange moment where no one, not ordinary folk like you and me, and certainly not celebrities, not business leaders, not politicians, we're living in a moment where no one seems to want to accept responsibilities for their actions. When folk get caught out praising Nazis and supporting the KKK, getting into physical altercations with a flight attendants over not wanting to wear masks that they knew well in advance that they would be required to wear. When folk get caught out doing this crazy stuff, and of course they are met with the disapprobation of those around them, rather than availing themselves of that ancient and grace-filled practice of repentance, what do? That's right. They outstretch their arms and they avail themselves instead of the nearest cross to which they proceed to nail themselves. It's not that I am being justly condemned because I'm a Nazi sympathizer and Holocaust denier, and those are fundamentally immoral and reprehensible things to be. Rather, it is that I am a godly person being nailed to the cross of faithless wokeism. Or so they argue. Into this craziness, however, Jesus breathes some sanity. Because what we find in this morning's readings is actually some fairly well-defined parameters that can help us gauge whether we and others are actually being martyred or whether we are just being morons. So our story opens up this morning on Jesus walking through the Galilean countryside, announcing the good news and healing every kind of disease and illness. As he saw the crowds coming out to meet him, he had compassion on them because he says they were confused and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Taking in all of these people and their great need, Jesus utters those famous words, "The harvest is great, but the workers are few." And almost immediately, he sets out to do something about that. In response to this great need that he observes, Jesus gathers around him his 12 disciples, and he grants them the power to heal every disease and affliction, the power to cast out demons. And with those new powers, he sends them out into the world to carry on and to expand his ministry, to be able to help more people. But as he sends them out with a lot of very specific instructions for what they are supposed to do and how they are supposed to do it. He offers them so many instructions, in fact, that we don't have time to get into them all today, so I just want to highlight 3 of them for us. Number 1, Jesus tells the disciples what their work will consist of. Namely, he says it will consist of proclaiming that the kingdom of heaven has come near, and then demonstrating as much by healing the sick, raising the dead, curing those with leprosy, and casting out demons. Now keep in mind, this whole venture began with Jesus recognizing a great need among his countrymen. And so he is sending this team out into the world to meet that observed need. Jesus does not have a political agenda that he is trying to push on people. He's not even trying to recruit them to join his spiritual revolution. He's simply trying to help folks in their need out of a deeply felt compassion for them. Number 2, Jesus tells the disciples how they should undertake this work of preaching and healing. Specifically, he tells them that they should receive no payment for their work. Give as freely as you have received, he tells them. What's more, he instructs them that they should not even take any money or even so much as a change of clothes with them as they go. Rather, they should depend entirely upon the hospitality of those they serve. So as his followers are going out into the world in response to the great need out there, they are not supposed to be profiting from their efforts. Jesus wants it to be abundantly clear that he and his followers are acting selflessly. Their mission isn't one of personal enrichment and self-promotion, but one of self-giving love. Thirdly and finally, Jesus tells the disciples that if the people they are trying to help do not welcome them or do not listen to their words, then as they leave that house or that town where they find themselves unwelcome, they should simply shake its dust from their feet as they go. Or as we would say in modern English, they should just wash their hands of it. So with this instruction, we can see very, very clearly that the disciples' mission is not about forcing others to change their beliefs or change their ways. Rather, their ministry is to be one of generous offer, right? Here is our message. Here is our healing. We offer both freely and without expectation for anything in return. Accept it or don't accept it. We're not going to fight with you. We're not going to put up a fuss. We're not going to condemn and judge you. We are only here to serve in love. If you're not picking up what we're putting down, that's fine. No big deal. We'll be on our way. And for doing these things in those ways, says Jesus, for compassionately responding to the real needs of the world through a ministry guided by the principles of self-giving love and generous offer, for actions that fall within those narrow parameters, Jesus tells his followers that they will be handed over to the courts. They will be flogged in the synagogues, will stand trial before governors and kings, and will be hated by all the nations. And so it follows that if you are being hated, condemned, and judged for those of your actions that fall outside of those narrow parameters, take off your hair shirt, put away your cross, because chances are that you are not the martyr that you think you are, and it's time for some serious self-reflection. And while there are any number of negative examples that could be lifted up, I'll invite you to doom scroll through your news feeds this week. You'll find at least one example, if not many examples, of people pretending to be martyrs. Instead, today, what I'd like to lift up is a great example of what being hated for the right reasons. What being hated for the right reasons looks like. And specifically, I want to lift up the example of one Father Helder Camara. Now, Father Helder Camara was an unlikely folk hero, to be sure. Standing at just under 5 feet tall and weighing about 90 pounds soaking wet, he was a tiny little guffer, entirely unimposing. But more so than his physical stature, what really made him an unlikely folk hero was the fact that he began his ministry as a young priest in Brazil, participating in a far-right fascist political organization called the Integralist Party. And as a member of that organization, Father Camara spearheaded a campaign to wipe out the shanty towns located on the hills all around Rio de Janeiro and relocate those residents to new housing in the cities. But what happened was this. They went and they bulldozed down all those shacks and those shanties that forcibly moved their inhabitants into the city. But once there, those folks who had been uprooted were reeling from this forced relocation, and they were still without jobs to support themselves. So they did what they had to do in order to survive. Some pulled the electric fittings and water taps out of their new abodes and sold them for money. Others moved out onto the street. They became homeless so that they could sublet their apartments to other people just to get by. Suffice it is to say, Father Camara's campaign was an abject failure. However, what it did succeed in doing was bringing Father Camara face to face with the poorest of Brazil's poor for the very first time, and he was forever changed by it. Out of this experience, he ended up leaving that far-right organization and began to talk in his sermons about, quote-unquote, unjust structures of poverty and how the church needed to work not just for people, but with people. Father Camara took this perspective with him when he was appointed archbishop of a particularly impoverished area of the country some 30 years later, eschewing all the usual trappings of that office, a literal palace to live in, brightly colored robes, all manner of gold jewelry with which to bling himself out in. He chose instead to live a life of radical solidarity with the poor, taking up residence in a small house behind a church, wearing only a brown cassock and a wooden cross around his neck, and eating all his meals at a bar on the corner surrounded by construction workers and alcoholics. Now, as it so happens, The same year that he was appointed archbishop, a fascist military dictatorship took over the Brazilian government. He observed that under their rule, the poor were suffering even more than before. Father Camara instituted all sorts of social programs to help meet the basic material and spiritual needs of the masses living in poverty in his archdiocese. He initiated feeding programs and housing projects. He established orphanages and a permanent campaign of charity for the needy, soon acquiring for himself an international reputation as the Bishop of the Slums. At the same time, he became an outspoken critic of the military regime, speaking in favor of governmental reform and weekly radio broadcasts. And while all of this ministry he was doing engendered a great deal of love among the common people, among those in power, it engendered a great deal of hatred. At first, Father Camara was simply blacklisted. He was labeled as a communist by the regime, and censors forbade the media from interviewing or quoting him. But every Sunday in his pulpit, he persisted in agitating for reform. His sermons are described by those who heard them as lyrical cries for social justice. But then one day, Father Camara opened the door of his house only to find a man standing there, a hired killer with his gun drawn. And this man said to him, he said, "I have come to assassinate you, Dom Helder." Dom being a Portuguese honorific. With equanimity of Gandhi, Camara responded, "Well, then you will send me straight to the Lord." Taken off guard by this reply, the man, himself from the impoverished classes, lowered his gun and let loose his tears. "I can't kill you," the man sobbed. "You belong to God." Now, in my line of work, it's not often that I get the opportunity to say this, but that assassin was right. Helder Camara belonged to God. He was a true follower of Jesus Christ. And how do we know that? Well, we know that because Helder Camara compassionately responded to the real needs of the world through a ministry guided by the principles of self-giving love and generous offer. And for that, he was hated. Friends, may we be blessed to be hated for the same reasons too.